On my birthday, my best friend hugged me, while her betrayal sat in my inbox. I woke on my birthday with a heaviness I couldn't quite name, the kind that settles in your chest before your mind has a reason to explain it. The room was quiet, washed in that pale morning light that usually makes me feel grounded. But today it only made the walls seem farther away. I lay still, listening to the distant hum of cars outside, trying to let the day feel like mine. Birthdays used to come with an easy kind of excitement. I'd wake up expecting the messages, the calls, the familiar warmth of people remembering me without reminders. But this year, I felt a strange emptiness, like something had already shifted before I opened my eyes. I checked my phone out of habit, hoping the feeling would fade. The screen lit up with a few early texts, the kind people send just to beat the rush. But the one I searched for, the message from my best friend, was short, almost flat. Just a quick, happy birthday. Nothing like the voice notes or inside jokes she usually sent before sunrise. I stared at it longer than I should have, waiting for more, waiting for her to follow it up the way she always did. But nothing came. We'd been close for years, close enough that she could read my moods before I said a word. She'd made every birthday feel like a small celebration even when no one else bothered. Lately, though, something between us felt thinner, like the thread we'd held onto for so long was quietly fraying. Her replies had grown shorter. Her calls came less often. And when we did talk, she sounded distracted, as if her attention lived somewhere else entirely. I tried brushing it off, telling myself she was busy or tired or dealing with things she didn't want to talk about yet. People change, routines shift, and friendships bend to make space for life. But the part that unsettled me was how intentional her distance felt. Not accidental, not circumstantial, chosen. Lying there with my phone still in my hand, I replayed the past few weeks. The canceled plans, the missed callbacks, the way she'd rushed off the last time we met like she had somewhere more important to be. None of it was loud enough to accuse her of anything, but together, they created a quiet ache I couldn't shake. A small voice whispered that something was wrong, though I kept telling it to be quiet. I placed my phone face down on the blanket, trying to breathe past the unease settling deeper inside me. My birthday wasn't supposed to start with overthinking. It was supposed to feel light, familiar, maybe even hopeful. I tried to imagine her showing up later with that chaotic energy she always brought into a room, pretending she hadn't been distant at all. Maybe she'd planned something. Maybe I was reading too much into small things. Still, the silence in the room pressed against me, reminding me that things weren't the same. Not with her, not within me. I got up anyway, forcing my feet onto the cool floor, telling myself a warm shower and fresh clothes might wash off whatever strange mood I'd woken into. The scent of soap and steam helped a little, softening the edges of my discomfort. After dressing, I moved through my morning routine slower than usual, noticing how quiet everything felt. Even the breakfast I made tasted dull, like my senses were working through fog. It wasn't sadness exactly, just a kind of emotional disorientation, as if I'd stepped into a version of my life where something familiar was missing. I kept checking my phone without meaning to, hoping for another message from her, something that sounded more like us. But the screen stayed still. No follow-up, no call. The gap between what I expected and what I received grew heavy enough to feel physical. I tried to remind myself of all the years she'd been there for me, all the moments she'd shown up without hesitation. One distant morning didn't erase all of that. People have off days. And yet, a part of me couldn't ignore the sense that today's distance wasn't new. It was just clearer. Still, I wasn't ready to let a mood ruin my birthday. Told myself to get out, breathe fresh air, and let the day unfold before deciding how to feel about it. Maybe she'd surprise me. Maybe the strange weight in my chest would fade once I was surrounded by people who cared. So I grabbed my keys, took one last look at the quiet room, and chose to step outside. I didn't know what the day would bring, but I tried to carry hope with me, even if it felt thinner than usual. I kept going. Arriving at the small gathering my best friend organized, I felt an immediate disconnect. The living room was warm, lit with soft string lights she always used for events, but the glow didn't reach me the way it used to. Everything felt slightly staged. She greeted me with a smile that didn't match her eyes. Her voice was cheerful, but there was a stiffness underneath it, like she was following a script. I tried not to read into it, but the feeling settled quickly in my chest. The guests were familiar, family, a couple of close friends, people who had been part of my life for years. They chatted easily, their voices blending with the faint music playing from a speaker. Still, standing there, I felt like I'd arrived at a party meant for someone else. My best friend moved around the room with forced enthusiasm, offering snacks, adjusting plates, laughing at moments that weren't funny. Every gesture seemed slightly delayed, as though she was remembering what she was supposed to do. I noticed her hands shake lightly when she reached for a tray. At one point, she brushed past me, her perfume familiar but distant. She apologized for bumping into me, even though she barely touched me. She never apologized for small things, not with me. When her phone buzzed, she snatched it quickly, tilting the screen away before silencing it. She smiled again, pretending it was nothing, but the quickness of her movements, the way her shoulders tightened, told me otherwise. I watched her from across the room, noticing details I'd never paid attention to before. She kept glancing toward the hallway as if expecting someone. Her laughter rose too quickly when someone spoke to her. She left conversations abruptly when her phone lit up again. People around me seemed happy to celebrate, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being an outsider. It was my birthday, yet I felt like I was standing behind glass, watching everyone from a distance. Even small talk felt heavier than it should have. My best friend eventually brought me a slice of cake, holding it out with a soft smile. The gesture should have warmed me, but something about the way she kept her eyes lowered made it feel hollow. She asked if I was having a good time, her voice gentle but oddly rehearsed. As we spoke, her phone buzzed again, lighting up against her palm. She moved it subtly, shielding the lock screen. I pretended not to notice, but my stomach tightened. She used to leave her phone face up without a second thought. I reminded myself that hosting could be stressful. Maybe she wanted everything perfect. Maybe I was overthinking, but each forced laugh, each glance over her shoulder, made it harder to ignore how distant she felt. The decorations were the kind I normally loved. Soft colors, minimal touches, a cake with my favorite frosting. But tonight, they felt like props on a stage, arranged by someone who remembered the details but not the meaning. She whispered to another guest at one point, her voice low and tense. When she noticed me looking, she straightened quickly and forced another smile. Guilt flickered across her expression before she pushed it away. By the time I stepped aside to refill my drink, I felt the weight of the room pressing on me. Everyone else seemed relaxed, unaware of the strange energy beneath the surface. I rested my hand on the counter, grounding myself, and then I saw it again. Her phone lit up. She turned her body slightly, shielding the lock screen with a practiced movement she'd never used before. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it sharpened my unease. I stood there quietly, steadying my breath. Whatever was happening, she was hiding it deliberately, and I wasn't sure why. Still, I told myself to stay present, to let the evening be what it was. It was my birthday. Even if the celebration felt like a performance, I wasn't ready to let the unease take everything. So I moved through the room slowly, trying to settle into conversations, hoping they would distract me from the tension curling in my stomach. A few relatives asked how I'd been, their voices warm and familiar, and I answered as naturally as I could. But even while speaking to them, part of my attention drifted back to her. I kept noticing the little shifts, the way she hovered near the edges of groups, the way her fingers tapped nervously against her glass, the way her smile faltered when she looked down at her phone. That I used to think our friendship was the kind you could build a lifetime on. We met when we were young, at an age when trust forms quickly and deeply, before life teaches you to hesitate. She'd walked into my world with that bright, easy energy that made people feel seen, and I was no exception. We clicked without effort, the way some people just do. Over the years, she became my constant, the person I called when something good happened, and even more when something bad did. She knew my stories, my patterns, my insecurities. She remembered the tiny details other people always forgot. like the way I take my coffee or the songs that help me think. I trusted her with things I didn't voice to anyone else. We went through milestones together: birthdays, graduations, breakups, job changes. She was there when I felt lost, sitting with me in silence when words weren't enough. I stood by her too, through her heartbreaks and rough patches, offering whatever I could. Our bond felt balanced, steady, something I never questioned. But looking back, the early cracks were there, small enough that I brushed them aside. The first time she canceled plans, she said she wasn't feeling well. I believed her. The second time, she said she forgot. I laughed it off because we were comfortable enough to tease each other about things like that. Then came the moments when she seemed distracted, even when we were together. She'd drift off mid-conversation, her eyes shifting toward her phone or the window. When I asked if something was wrong, she smiled too quickly and said she was just tired. I didn't push it. Back then, I didn't want to read too deeply into anything that felt off. There were promises she made and didn't follow through on. Small ones, but noticeable. She'd say she'd call back and didn't. She'd agree to meet somewhere and arrive late without explanation. Those things never defined her before, so when they started happening, they created a quiet confusion in me. Still, I told myself it wasn't important enough to address. Sometimes she'd share less than she used to. Instead of telling me everything, she'd give short answers, vague updates, or change topics abruptly. I assumed life was just overwhelming for her. We were both getting older, busier, less available. It felt natural for friendships to adjust. But the truth is, it bothered me more than I admitted. I missed the way she used to talk to me, open and unfiltered. I missed our long late-night conversations, the ones that made us feel like the world outside didn't exist. I missed being the person she trusted without hesitation. I remember a moment that stands out now, though it didn't seem significant at the time. We were sitting at a cafe we used to visit often. She kept looking at the door, tapping her fingers against her cup like she was waiting for something or someone. She smiled at me, but her attention flickered away before I finished speaking. I tried to joke about her being distracted, and she laughed, but the sound didn't reach her eyes. I pushed the feeling down. There were days when I sensed she wasn't being fully honest. Not about anything major, just small inconsistencies. She'd say she was home when I could hear the echo of a different room. She'd mention being alone, but I'd catch a second voice in the background. When I asked, she brushed it off casually, and I accepted it because questioning her felt unnecessary. Now, though, every small hesitation, every vague excuse, every broken promise feels connected, like threads leading to something I didn't want to see. The moments that once seemed harmless now feel weighted, as if they were early warnings I ignored. There was one moment in particular that I can't shake. We were supposed to meet for lunch, a plan she made days earlier. The morning of, she texted that something came up and she couldn't make it. Her message felt rushed, like she typed it quickly and didn't want to elaborate. I let it go, but of a conversation I wasn't allowed to enter. And yet, I tried. I tried to talk to her, to be present, to offer support the way I always had. I sent funny texts, asked her about her day, remembered the little things she liked. Sometimes she answered warmly, but more often, it felt like she was performing a version of herself she thought I wanted to see. The person I trusted had begun to feel like a stranger wearing familiar skin. I started noticing moments that didn't make sense. A sudden disappearance for hours with vague explanations. A laugh shared with someone I didn't know. A story she told one day that contradicted something from the week before. None of it was loud or confrontational. It was the quiet drip of inconsistencies that left me questioning everything. I caught myself rereading old texts, looking for clues that weren't obvious, hoping I'd misread the signs. The more I observed, the heavier it became. There was a subtle shift in our interactions, one that I couldn't shake. I felt replaced in ways I couldn't fully define, pushed to the margins of moments I had always shared with her. It wasn't just that she was spending time with others. It was that she was leaving me out deliberately, carefully, and it hurt more than I wanted to admit. Every time I confronted my thoughts, I tried to silence them. Don't overthink, I told myself, repeating it like a mantra. She's just busy. She's stressed. You're imagining things. But the words didn't stick. The feeling that something deeper was happening refused to be ignored. My chest tightened, my stomach knotted, and the little voice I had dismissed for years started whispering, warning me to pay attention. I remembered how she used to share everything with me. The small victories, the frustrations, the mundane moments that made us laugh together. That openness was gone now, replaced with carefully measured words, rehearsed stories, and a distance I couldn't explain. It felt like I was seeing her for the first time in months, but through a filter I wasn't allowed to remove. Even when we met in person, there was a subtle tension, a nervous energy she didn't usually carry. Her eyes darted around, her phone always near, her laughter timed too perfectly. I wanted to ask her what was going on, to demand honesty, but I didn't. I told myself to be patient, to trust that our bond was strong enough to survive a rough patch. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. By the end of that month, the quiet changes had coalesced into something undeniable. I felt confusion, hurt, and a sense of being replaced swirling together into a weight that pressed against my chest. I kept going through the motions, talking to her, meeting up, acting like nothing had shifted. But every time she smiled, every time her phone buzzed, every time she glanced at someone else, the knot in my stomach tightened. I told myself, again and again, not to overthink, even as I felt the truth edging closer. I knew something deeper was happening, something she wasn't sharing. The unease that had started small had grown into a quiet certainty. Things weren't the same between us, and I had to confront the fact that this month had changed everything. Whether I wanted it to or not, it wasn't one single event that made me start noticing the secrets. It was the accumulation of small things I had chosen to ignore. At first, I told myself they were harmless quirks. Late-night messages, the quick flinches when her phone buzzed, a laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. I explained them away as privacy or stress, convincing myself that trusting her meant letting some things go unseen. But the patterns became impossible to dismiss. She started guarding her devices, moving her laptop screen when I walked by, taking calls with her back turned to the room. I noticed her passcode changing, the new rhythm of tapping digits quietly, almost ritualistic. It wasn't dramatic, but it was deliberate. Every small adjustment felt like a line drawn between us, a private world she had built without me. There were nights when she disappeared for hours with vague excuses. I ran into someone, she'd say, voice casual, even cheerful, but the words hung strangely. The timing didn't add up. Sometimes I tried to let it slide, to believe her story, but my instincts, honed by the subtle changes I'd noticed over the past weeks, whispered otherwise. Something was happening that I wasn't allowed to see. Friends started noticing too, though they didn't know the full story. Hints came in casual conversation, offhand comments about how she'd been different lately, distant or distracted. I smiled and nodded, masking the worry growing in me. I wanted to believe them wrong, to believe I had misread her. But deep down, I knew they were right. Something had shifted, and I had been ignoring it for too long. I began to see the careful choreography in her actions. When someone mentioned a topic she didn't want to discuss, her attention would drift. She'd steer the conversation elsewhere, smooth and practiced, but I could see the flicker of discomfort in her eyes. She became protective not just of her devices, but of her time, her space, the information she shared with anyone, including me. There was one afternoon when I realized just how much I had been pretending not to notice. She returned from an outing with a strange energy, a mixture of relief and tension. She smiled, hugged me briefly, then left the room with a hurried excuse about needing to check something. Later, I discovered that the details she'd given me didn't match what I learned from others. A lie, small perhaps, but deliberate. I felt the sting of betrayal, a quiet ache that spread through me. And yet, I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. I told myself maybe it wasn't serious, maybe it was temporary. I wanted to believe the best of her, to preserve the image of the friendship I had trusted for years. But every lie, every secretive gesture, chipped away at that trust, leaving tiny cracks that widened with every interaction. Sometimes I caught her in moments of contradiction, a laugh shared in secrecy, a phrase that hinted at another story, a look she quickly hid behind her hand. It was subtle, easily dismissible if I wasn't paying attention, but I was. I had been paying attention for weeks, though I refused to admit it, because acknowledging it meant accepting a painful reality I wasn't ready to face. I found myself replaying old encounters, noticing the details I had ignored or explained away before. The late-night messages, the calls she took outside, the small evasions when I asked about her day. I realized I had been selecting which truths to see, choosing to overlook the rest because confronting them would hurt too much. I had been pretending not to see the obvious. The tension grew heavier with every passing day. I began to notice the moments she avoided eye contact, the micro-expressions that slipped despite her attempts to appear normal. It was in the subtle curling of her lips, the rapid blink, the way her hand shook slightly when she answered her phone. I could feel it before I saw it, a pulse of unease that told me the facade was brittle. Finally, there was the moment I could no longer ignore. She had vanished for hours one evening, claiming she'd been at a friend's house. Later, I discovered she hadn't been there. The truth hit like cold water, sharp, undeniable. I realized I had been ignoring the truth for months, not because it wasn't there, but because I didn't want to lose her. The friendship I had cherished for years had blinded me to the small betrayals piling up. I sat with that knowledge quietly, feeling both heartbreak and a strange relief. I knew the signs had always been there, scattered across weeks and months, but I had been choosing not to see them. Pretending not to notice allowed me to preserve a version of our friendship that no longer existed. The pain came from knowing I had ignored the warnings, that I had actively suspended my own intuition for the comfort of denial. And yet, even in that realization, there was a strange clarity. I could finally acknowledge that the cracks were real, that her actions were intentional, that my instincts had been right all along. The small betrayals, the evasions, the secrecy, they were pieces of a pattern I had tried to dismiss, pieces that now could not be ignored. I had been pretending not to see, but now I had no choice. By the end of that night, I felt the weight of the truth pressing down, heavy but tangible. I understood that ignoring the secrets had not protected me. It had only delayed the inevitable confrontation with reality. I was no longer blind to the subtle betrayals, no longer willing to explain them away. I sat in quiet reflection, feeling the sting of hurt and the sharpening clarity of awareness, finally accepting that the truth had been there all along. The morning of my birthday, before the party, I woke to the usual sounds of the city outside my window, the hum of traffic, the distant rumble of a bus, birds trilling as they always did. But there was a subtle tension in the air I couldn't shake. My phone vibrated on the nightstand, and when I glanced at it, a notification caught my eye. It was an email, new and unread. The preview line froze me. Her name was in the subject. My chest tightened before I even opened it. I stared at the screen, feeling that familiar pull of anxiety and disbelief, the same tight coil I'd been pretending not to feel for weeks. Something about her name in that context felt wrong. It wasn't cheerful. It wasn't lighthearted. Carried a weight I couldn't explain. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to swipe open the email immediately, to confront whatever truth was waiting for me. But another part, an instinct I didn't fully trust yet, urged me to wait. I had a party to get through. I had to try to salvage the day before letting anything ruin it. Still, the pull of curiosity, of dread, tugged at me relentlessly. I reached for my coffee, hoping the warmth and the familiar aroma would steady me. The mug was too hot, burning my fingertips slightly, but I didn't notice. My mind kept returning to the notification, the weight of her name in that line making my stomach twist. I took a sip, tasting bitterness that didn't belong, feeling the anxiety coil tighter with every heartbeat. I thought about opening it. My thumb hovered over the screen. What if it was nothing serious? A misdirected message? A mistake? Rationally, it could be something mundane, but my gut refused to believe it. I remembered all the subtle signs I had ignored, the evasions, the secrecy, the little inconsistencies that had been stacking up over weeks. This email felt like the culmination of all of it. I tried to push it from my mind. I dressed slowly, feeling the weight of every movement. The zipper of my jacket felt heavier than usual. The floor was cool beneath my bare feet, grounding me in the moment, yet it did little to quell the rising tension. I forced myself to think of the birthday ahead, of laughter, friends, and small celebrations. Maybe I could still protect the day. Maybe I could pretend nothing had changed. But the email sat there, blinking silently in the corner of the screen, a quiet accusation I couldn't shake. My chest ached with anticipation. Should I check it now, or should I wait until the party ended? I kept asking myself the same questions over and over, but the answer didn't come. I felt trapped between the need to know and the desire to preserve the fragile calm of the morning. I moved through my routine mechanically, brushing my teeth, washing my face, tying my shoes, each task deliberate, each breath heavy with unspoken tension. My mind kept looping back to that subject line. What could she have done? Was it something serious, or was my anxiety building shadows where there were none? Couldn't tell. And that uncertainty was the most unsettling part. Every little sound felt sharper that morning. The creak of the door, the hum of my computer starting up, the distant honk of a horn. It all seemed magnified, echoing in the space between my worry and my hope. I wanted to believe this was just my imagination, that everything would go back to normal once I saw her later, smiled, laughed, and pushed the unease aside. I sat for a moment on the edge of my bed, staring at the notification, debating whether I had the courage to face it. I felt my pulse in my throat, rapid and insistent. I could almost hear my own heartbeat in the quiet apartment, each thump a warning I didn't want to acknowledge. Part of me longed to open it, to rip away the veil of uncertainty, even if the truth hurt. Another part of me begged to wait, to preserve the day, to step into the party as if everything were ordinary. Finally, I made a decision. I ignored it. I pressed the phone face down on the nightstand, trying to breathe past the tightness in my chest. I told myself I would focus on the day, on the people who loved me, on the small joy of celebrating another year. But underneath that attempt at normalcy, the tension remained. I dressed, grabbed my bag, and took one last glance at the phone. The email waited silently, unread, a reminder that the truth was already there, sitting quietly in my inbox. I stepped outside into the morning light, trying to shake the anxiety that had settled into my bones, hoping the warmth of the day could hold off the storm I knew was coming. Even as I walked toward the car, I could feel it pressing at the back of my mind, that unshakable certainty that this wasn't going to be just another birthday. Something had shifted, something had changed, and in my chest, I carried the quiet weight of knowing that what waited unread would alter everything. Whether I was ready or not, when I walked into the party, the room smelled of warm candles and faint vanilla frosting, the air buzzing with laughter and clinking glasses. She was there, smiling like she always did, but as soon as she saw me, the hug she offered felt different, tighter than usual, almost rehearsed, like she had practiced it in front of a mirror. Her eyes met mine for a brief second, and I caught it. A flicker of something unsettled, something guilty, before she pulled back and masked it with her usual smile. I froze for a moment, the world around me slowing as I registered the mismatch. Everything about that embrace was too calculated, too precise. It should have felt comforting, familiar, but instead it carried a strange weight, a quiet apology I couldn't place. She stepped back and laughed lightly, nudging me toward the living room where friends and family were gathered. I smiled in return, but inside, my mind raced. Something about her eyes, the way they darted quickly toward the doorway and back, screamed that she was carrying a secret I wasn't supposed to know. I tried to push the thought aside, focusing on the music and chatter, but it lingered like a shadow over the celebration. She moved around the room with practiced ease, greeting guests, adjusting plates, offering small talk, yet every gesture seemed just a little off. Her laughter came too quickly, as if timing it correctly mattered more than feeling it. And whenever someone mentioned a name or event she didn't want to discuss, she shifted subtly, steering the conversation elsewhere. I noticed her subtle cues, shoulders tensing, a flick of her gaze toward the kitchen, a quick swallow. I caught her stealing glances at another guest more than once. quick, almost imperceptible, but deliberate enough to make my stomach twist. She'd glance back at me with that same forced smile, eyes avoiding mine for just a heartbeat too long. Something was happening, something I wasn't meant to see. At one point, she came over to help me with my drink. Her hand brushed mine lightly, lingering just enough to feel familiar. But her eyes told a different story. Unease, maybe even guilt. I didn't say anything, didn't want to disturb the fragile balance she seemed determined to maintain. Yet every nerve in my body was alert, noticing the subtle inconsistencies I had trained myself to overlook. Her phone buzzed again, and she instinctively moved it to shield the screen, just as she had been doing for weeks. The motion was quick, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but I saw it. The same instinctive shielding, the same tension in her shoulders. I pretended not to notice, but my heart was racing. Each little act felt like confirmation that the distance between us wasn't accidental, that she was hiding something significant. I tried to remind myself it could be innocent, that maybe she was just nervous hosting or overwhelmed by the people in the room. But the combination of gestures, glances, and that mismatched hug told me otherwise. The unease settled deep in my chest, pressing down like a weight I couldn't lift. It wasn't just a feeling of being left out. It was the knowledge that something had shifted between us, something deliberate. The room carried on around me. Laughter, glasses clinking, music playing softly. But I felt removed, observing everything from the edge. She moved past me again, offering polite smiles, chatting briefly with others, but her eyes never fully met mine. I caught her once leaning toward a guest, whispering something quickly before straightening and facing the group. The subtle secrecy stung more than any argument or confrontation could have. I tried to breathe, tried to focus on the moments that were supposed to be light and celebratory. But my attention kept snapping back to her. The way she hugged, the way she laughed, the way she avoided direct eye contact when she thought no one was looking. I realized I couldn't ignore it any longer. Finally, when the party reached a lull, I stepped away for a moment, letting myself lean against the wall. The hum of conversation surrounded me, but my mind was elsewhere. That hug, that fleeting look in her eyes, had cracked open the quiet bubble I had been trying to maintain. I knew what I had to do next, even if I wasn't ready yet. The email still sat unread in my inbox, a silent promise of confirmation. And now, with the subtle betrayals all around me, I felt its weight more than ever. I wanted to wait until the party ended, to hold on to what little normalcy was left. But the tension was suffocating, a quiet pressure that refused to be ignored. I straightened, taking a slow breath, feeling the bittersweet sting of anticipation and dread. I would wait a little longer, keep pretending to enjoy the celebration, even as every instinct screamed that the truth was there. Waiting, and impossible to ignore forever, I left the party early, pretending I was tired, needing rest after the excitement. The house behind me hummed with voices and laughter, the warm glow of string lights spilling into the evening air, but none of it reached me. I drove home in silence, the city passing in blurred streaks of light, the tension in my chest coiling tighter with every mile. The anticipation of the unread email pressed on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Once inside my apartment, I dropped my bag and sank into the couch. The room smelled faintly of candles I had burned earlier in the week, something comforting yet hollow now. I stared at my laptop on the coffee table, its screen dark, waiting for me to confront it. I could feel my pulse in my throat, rapid and insistent, each beat amplifying the dread I had been carrying for days. Finally, I reached out, my fingers trembling slightly, and opened the email. Her name stared back at me in the subject line, familiar yet alien. My eyes scanned the content, and in an instant, the quiet unease I'd felt for weeks erupted into something I couldn't contain. Screenshots, messages, hidden conversations. Everything she had concealed was laid bare, raw and undeniable. My stomach dropped, a cold hollow replacing the warmth of the evening. I read through her words, her laughter, her lies. Every carefully constructed excuse, every small evasive gesture I had ignored, clicked into place. It wasn't just secrecy, it was betrayal, deliberate and ongoing. The realization hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my hands shake as I scrolled, searching for something, anything that could make it less real. Disbelief washed over me first. How could someone I had trusted so completely hide something like this? How could she maintain the warmth, the closeness, the jokes, while weaving a web of lies that never touched anyone else but me? My chest ached, tight and heavy, and my vision blurred for a moment as the truth settled in. I reread parts of the email, as if repetition could make the situation less devastating. But every line reinforced it. She had been living a dual life, one version shown to me, the other carefully hidden. I could trace her patterns, her deliberate omissions, and the people involved. Each new revelation was like a small punch, accumulating into a larger, more painful impact. Anger came next, sharp and burning. Not loud or explosive, but a quiet, simmering fury that licked at the edges of my reason. How had I not noticed sooner? How had I ignored the small signs, the subtle lies, the evasions that now screamed betrayal? The realization made my hands clench, the tightness in my chest worsening, a physical echo of the emotional wound forming inside me. But alongside anger, there was a deeper ache, heartbreak, raw and intimate. The weight of the friendship I had cherished for years, the trust one had placed entirely in her, felt like it had been scooped away. I remembered the hugs, the late-night calls, the milestones we'd celebrated together, and each memory now carried a shadow of doubt. I felt the sting of having been blind, complicit in my own heartbreak by pretending not to see. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling, the quiet hum of the city outside my window matching the whirlwind in my head. The betrayal was tangible now, not just a whisper in the corners of my mind, but a clear, undeniable truth sitting in front of me. I felt the simultaneous weight of grief and clarity, the mix of loss and understanding that comes with seeing the full scope of someone's deceit. Guilt settled over me as well, not for her but for myself, for ignoring the signs, for rationalizing her evasions, for giving her the benefit of the doubt over and over. I realized I had been training myself to trust blindly, to overlook the hints because facing them would hurt too much. Now the hurt had arrived, uninvited and uncompromising. I wanted answers immediately, but the depth of the betrayal made me hesitate. Confronting her emotionally in that moment felt dangerous, impulsive, and ineffective. I had to process first to understand the full scope before taking any step. The temptation to reply, to demand the truth face to face, clawed at me, but I knew it wasn't the right move, not yet. Instead, I stayed quiet, letting the reality of the situation sink in. I reread pieces of the email, examining timelines, inconsistencies, patterns. Every previous memory of her actions, the evasive glances, the hidden phone, the strange laughter, aligned perfectly with the evidence before me. It was all intentional. Nothing had been accidental. Hours passed in stillness, punctuated by my shallow breathing and the occasional shiver of disbelief. I felt both crushed and awake at the same time, the duality of heartbreak and awareness coursing through me. I knew that I had to confront the truth eventually, that avoidance was no longer possible. But for now, I simply sat with the weight of knowing, letting the shock and grief coexist with the simmering fire of resolve. The email had confirmed everything I had feared, everything I had suspected in moments I had tried to ignore. And while I wasn't ready to act, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. After opening the email, I couldn't stop replaying everything I had seen over the past weeks and months. Each conversation, each laugh, every gesture I had thought was ordinary now carried a shadow. Memories that once felt safe now felt tainted. Every subtle look, every unexplained absence, every protective move over her phone. It all clicked together into a web I hadn't wanted to see. I started piecing it together, retracing the timeline in my head. The canceled plans that had seemed like forgetfulness, the stories that never quite lined up, the vague explanations she gave when I asked questions. All of it began to make sense. There were patterns I had ignored, small threads connecting to larger inconsistencies that suddenly screamed with clarity. I opened old messages, rereading text exchanges with her. What once felt friendly and casual now carried hidden meaning. Jokes that had seemed harmless took on a different tone. Words she had used, carefully chosen, had masked secrets I now knew were real. Every smile I remembered, every hug, every time she said she was just busy. They were all pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to see. Looking at photos, I noticed subtle things I'd overlooked. She would pose casually with me in pictures, but the angles of her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, tiny, almost imperceptible cues that had seemed normal at the time, now told a story of careful performance. She had maintained a facade for me, one I had bought into without question, never realizing that behind it was a reality I hadn't been allowed to witness. I began analyzing her social media, looking for inconsistencies between what she had told me and what she had shown publicly. The posts, the likes, the tagged photos, they all lined up with the evidence in the email. Small details revealed herself in ways she had tried to hide. Outings she claimed were solo were group events. People she described vaguely had names and faces. Everything fit together too perfectly to be coincidence. The more I dug, the clearer it became. This betrayal was not accidental. It wasn't the result of oversight or a momentary lapse in judgment. Every omission, every lie, every hidden message was intentional. She had carefully curated the version of herself I got to see while keeping the real life separate. That realization stung in ways I hadn't anticipated. The quiet ache in my chest replaced by a sharper, colder awareness. I traced the role of others as well. Certain people were involved, knowingly or unknowingly, in supporting the separation of our worlds. Some had played parts in the deception, even casually, without realizing the damage it caused. Others had been unaware but present, their presence giving her the cover she needed. Every connection, every name I recognized, became another thread in the intricate web she had spun. I replayed her actions in my mind, from small to large. The forced laughter, the glances at her phone, the stories she told one way to me and another way to others. All of it followed a pattern now undeniable. The emotional labor she had spent performing closeness was exhausting just to imagine, and it filled me with a strange mix of grief and awe. Grief for the trust one had misplaced, awe at the level of control she had maintained over what I knew. I felt a mix of rage and clarity. Rage at the deception, the betrayal of trust, the manipulation of my perception. Clarity in understanding the scope, the timeline, and the intentionality. I could see now that the early signs I had ignored, the canceled plans, the vague answers, the subtle nervousness, weren't minor flaws. They were deliberate acts, the smallest threads that eventually formed a pattern too tight to ignore. The emotional escalation was inevitable. Grief turned into focus, heartbreak into strategic awareness. I realized that this wasn't just a lapse of honesty. It was a sustained campaign of omission, a careful weaving of lies to maintain a version of reality that excluded me. And with that awareness came resolve. I knew I needed to see the full picture before I could decide what to do next. I spent hours that night retracing every interaction, every exchange, every subtle shift in her behavior, connecting dots I had once chosen to ignore. Each memory shifted in meaning, becoming evidence of intention. The betrayal wasn't just an event, it was a network, an intricate structure built over time, each lie a supporting beam holding up the illusion. By the end of it, I understood something fundamental. This was never accidental. This was never a mistake. Everything she had done, every omission and hidden truth had been deliberate. The realization settled over me with the weight of finality. She had orchestrated her actions, knowingly, intentionally, and I had been left to unravel the truth on my own. I sat back, exhausted, the quiet hum of the city outside my window filling the space between thoughts. The grief was still there, but beneath it, a steady sense of clarity had taken root. I could see the web of lies, understand its construction, and trace the full arc of betrayal. And in that understanding, I finally felt ready to plan, to move forward, to face the consequences in my own way. That night, after weeks of uncertainty and months of subtle betrayals, I decided to follow the signs. I didn't plan anything dramatic. No confrontations, no shouting, no exposing her publicly. I just needed to see for myself, to confirm what my instincts had been whispering for so long. The air was cool and damp as I stepped outside, the faint smell of rain lingering on the streets. Each breath felt heavy, a mixture of dread and resolve. I drove slowly, retracing the places she had mentioned in passing. Cafes, stores, streets she claimed she had visited or not visited. I kept my eyes sharp, scanning for familiar figures, listening to the quiet sounds of the city at night. The headlights of passing cars glared briefly against the pavement, illuminating shadows that seemed to stretch longer than they should. My pulse was steady but tense, every sense alert, every turn calculated. She had told me she would never go to one particular place, a small, nondescript coffee shop downtown. I knew otherwise, or at least I suspected. I parked a block away and watched from the shadows, the neon light from the cafe flickering across the street. My stomach twisted in anticipation, a mixture of anxiety and something sharper, a quiet determination that had been building for weeks. Minutes passed. People came and went, faces blurred in the dim light. Then I saw her. She was there, exactly where I had suspected she would never be. She laughed softly with someone I didn't recognize at first, their heads close together in casual intimacy, their gestures familiar and comfortable in a way I had never shared with her. My chest tightened, a sharp, cold ache settling into my ribs. I stayed hidden, observing quietly. Every movement, every smile, every whispered word confirmed what I had feared. It wasn't just the absence of honesty, it was deliberate, intentional. She had constructed a private life parallel to mine, one I wasn't allowed to see, one she had carefully concealed. And now, seeing it firsthand, the betrayal crystallized in a way that no email or screenshot ever could. I felt a mix of emotions: hurt, disbelief, anger. But underneath it all, a steady focus emerged. The heartbreak was raw, gnawing at the edges of my chest, but it was tempered by clarity. I had been blind before, choosing to ignore the signs. Now everything was visible. Every lie, every evasive gesture, every small deception led to this moment. I watched them leave the cafe together, laughing softly, unaware of my presence. I noted their interactions carefully, the subtle touches, the ease, the way she moved freely without the careful mask she had worn around me. The contrast was undeniable. The version of her I had known, the one I trusted, was a construct, a performance designed to keep me in the dark. Driving home, I replayed the evening in my mind, the evidence stacking with each remembered gesture and every tiny clue I had previously overlooked. The clarity was painful but empowering. I could see now that the small betrayals, the evasions, the secrecy, they weren't random. They were all deliberate. She had built a pattern over time, carefully constructing what I perceived and controlling what I was allowed to know. The cool night air pressed against my skin as I walked back into my apartment. The quiet hum of the city outside matched the rhythm of my thoughts. I felt a quiet resolve growing in me, a steady pulse of determination that had replaced the raw ache of grief. I wouldn't act impulsively. I wouldn't let anger dictate my next steps. But I would no longer be naive, no longer overlook the truth in favor of comfort. I sat down at my desk, the faint glow of the lamp illuminating the room, and let the night settle around me. The evidence was in my mind, vivid and irrefutable. The betrayal was no longer abstract, no longer something I had to imagine or doubt. It existed, deliberate and undeniable. And now I had the power to respond in my own way, thoughtfully and intentionally. For the first time, I felt a strange kind of calm. The emotional storm that had raged inside me for weeks began to quiet, replaced with focus. I knew the next steps wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead would be painful, but I also knew I had clarity, and clarity was the strongest weapon I could wield. That night, I vowed to myself, no more naivety, no more overlooking the signs. I would gather everything I needed, understand the full scope, and plan carefully. The betrayal had been revealed, and the first step toward reclaiming control was knowing the truth. As I finally leaned back, letting the tension in my shoulders ease slightly. I felt the weight of the night and the months leading up to it settle. It was a quiet, heavy realization, but one that came with purpose. The web of lies had been exposed, and I was ready to face it, not with anger alone, but with resolve, patience, and a plan I had yet to fully form. The next day, she showed up at my door. I wasn't expecting her, and for a moment, my heart skipped. My chest tightened, a mixture of nerves and adrenaline, the quiet hum of tension filling the space between us. She smiled, that practiced smile I had once trusted, but something in her posture screamed caution, the careful choreography of someone trying not to reveal too much. "Hey," she said softly, tilting her head, eyes flicking toward the interior of my apartment and then back to mine. She tried to make the casual tone believable, but I could feel the undercurrent of anxiety in her movements. Her fingers twisted the strap of her bag, then released it, then twisted it again. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I had learned to notice these things. I let her in, keeping my own expression neutral, casual, like everything was ordinary. Every part of me was on alert, noticing the way her shoulders tensed when she stepped over the threshold, the way her eyes scanned the living room before settling on me. Her nervous energy was a quiet storm, and I was watching it unfold with careful attention. We sat on the couch, talking about mundane things, the weather, recent errands, mutual friends. She laughed lightly at my jokes, smiled at small comments, and moved her hands in gestures she had used countless times before. But there was a friction in her performance, a tension I could feel, as if each movement required conscious effort. I noticed the subtle shifts in her gaze, the way she glanced toward my laptop on the coffee table, where the evidence still lingered in the email I hadn't opened again yet. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice, and for a moment, I caught it. A slip, a flicker of something in her eyes, a flash of awareness. She paused mid-sentence, then corrected herself, her words slightly off-kilter, almost rehearsed. My pulse quickened. I could feel the quickening of her own heartbeat through the tension in her posture. It was like a quiet dance of avoidance, a careful balancing act between honesty and deception. I smiled, keeping my tone light, and asked a simple question about her plans for the day. She hesitated, a microsecond too long, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. She shifted in her seat, crossing and uncrossing her legs, moving subtly to regain composure. Every instinct told me she was measuring her words, testing me, wondering what I knew. My chest tightened again as I caught another small slip, a glance toward my phone on the counter, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes as if she feared something was already in motion. My stomach turned slightly. The email, unread but open in my mind, hovered between us. I could sense her awareness of it, the unspoken anxiety that I had picked up on months ago finally rising to the surface in a tangible way. I kept talking, casual, deliberate, careful to stay neutral. I didn't let my voice waver, didn't let my eyes give anything away. But inside, every nerve was alert. I watched her subtly, noting each movement, each flicker of emotion, each attempt to maintain control over her performance. It was a tense, quiet interaction, a silent battle of awareness and concealment. For a moment, I thought she might discover the truth. A slip of a word, a sudden pause, a glance too long. My heart raced. I could feel the potential for confrontation pressing against the fragile normalcy of the moment. Every instinct screamed that she knew I was closer to knowing than I had been before. I had to maintain calm, to stay strategic, even as the tension built between us. Time passed in this careful balance, the silence between sentences heavy with unspoken truths. I noticed how her hands fidgeted just enough to betray her anxiety, how her eyes flicked repeatedly toward my desk, toward my laptop, as if she feared the evidence might be revealed in a single glance. The awareness between us was electric, quiet but undeniable. Finally, she laughed softly at something trivial, a laugh that didn't fully reach her eyes, and I felt the tension in the room ease slightly. My own heartbeat slowed just enough for me to mask the storm of awareness inside. I realized then that I could no longer confront her emotionally, that any direct accusation would be premature, dangerous even. I had to move strategically. She stayed for another 15 minutes, chatting lightly, trying to anchor herself in the normalcy of the visit. I mirrored her efforts, keeping calm, observing, measuring every gesture. When she finally left, closing the door softly behind her, I exhaled, the tight coil of tension in my chest loosening slightly. I had survived the encounter, but I knew the battle was far from over. I sat on the couch afterward, staring at the space where she had been, replaying each subtle gesture, each fleeting glance. I knew now with certainty that she had almost discovered I knew. Almost, but not quite. And that knowledge, combined with the growing clarity I had built over weeks of observation, was a weapon I intended to use carefully. I realized, sitting there in the quiet of my apartment, that emotional confrontation wasn't an option. I needed patience, strategy, and observation. She had underestimated how closely I had been watching, and that miscalculation would become critical. I felt the first spark of calm resolve. I was ready to plan, ready to act, and no slip of hers would catch me unprepared again. After surviving that near encounter, I knew I needed to understand why. Not just the what of her betrayal, but the why that had driven her to carefully construct a parallel life, to hide pieces of herself from me for months. I pored over the emails and messages again, reading them slowly, methodically, looking for clues, not just of her actions, but of her motivations. It became clear almost immediately that this wasn't random, and it wasn't about me at all. The lies, the evasions, the secrecy, they were rooted in her own insecurities. Patterns emerged in her words. Jealousy disguised as casual comments, frustration disguised as jokes, subtle resentment hidden beneath small betrayals. I could see how she had rationalized each step, how she had convinced herself she was entitled to this hidden life, separate from our friendship. I traced her behavior back over months. Moments I had once attributed to stress now made sense. The cancellations, the fleeting distractions, the way she seemed anxious whenever I asked about her day. She wasn't just distracted. She was managing a careful balancing act, keeping her public persona aligned with my expectations while indulging a private narrative that excluded me. Every micro-choice revealed a deeper insecurity, a fear of being judged, of being limited, of not being seen the way she wanted. I also saw how others had influenced her. Certain people she spent time with, new friends, colleagues, someone who had entered her life recently, seemed to encourage, even subtly reward, her secrecy. It wasn't just passive influence. There was active shaping of her behavior, a quiet push toward hiding pieces of herself. I could see references in messages where advice had been offered, where her choices had been validated. She had become caught in a loop of external encouragement and internal rationalization, and I had been left outside the loop entirely. The emotional devastation was undeniable. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand answers, to confront the reasons that had been carefully hidden from me. But another part, a quieter, sharper part, recognized a strange relief. I finally understood. I could see the origin of her actions, the tipping points, the insecurities that had built over time. It didn't excuse the betrayal, but it framed it, gave it context, made it a human act of fear and desire rather than something random or incomprehensible. I traced the real turning point in her behavior. It had been months ago, a subtle shift that I had overlooked at the time. She had met someone new, someone who became a central figure in her private life, someone who influenced her sense of self and the way she managed her public persona. That relationship, or perhaps even just the perception of it, had catalyzed the changes, the hidden actions, the need to maintain two realities. I felt a pang of sorrow realizing how carefully she had protected that life from me, how intentionally she had excluded me even as she maintained the illusion of closeness. Reading through her old messages again, I noticed the patterns of emotional calculation. Distant, I let the realization sink in. Her actions were never about me. They had always been about her. That knowledge was painful, but it was also empowering. For the first time, I could separate my hurt from my judgment, and in that separation, I found the clarity to start thinking about the steps I would take next. That I found out about the last piece of her betrayal on a night when I wasn't even thinking about her anymore. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator filling the silence, trying to convince myself that I had reached the end of the story. But then a message popped up from someone I never expected, someone who had never involved themselves in drama before. And the moment I opened it, the floor under me shifted. He told me he didn't want to interfere, but he thought I should know something. His words came slowly, almost hesitant, like he was afraid of how they'd land. As I read them, I felt my pulse picking up, that strange tightening in my chest that always comes when you sense another truth unburying itself. He said my best friend had been talking about me long before the birthday, long before the message I found in my inbox. At first, I didn't understand. I stared at his text, reading the same sentence 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Then he explained. She had been quietly planting seeds with people around us, shaping the way they saw me. Not openly, she was smarter than that. She used half-jokes, tiny comments, little sighs of concern disguised as friendship. All of it painted me as dramatic or unstable. I felt heat move up the back of my neck. I remembered moments I had brushed off. People going quiet when I walked into a room, someone making a joke that didn't feel like a joke, the way certain friends had grown distant without explanation. I had blamed myself. I always blamed myself first, but her fingerprints were everywhere. He asked me if I remembered the conflict last year, the one that nearly tore our group apart. I did. I remembered how confused I had been, how I couldn't understand why everything escalated so quickly. Then he said it. She was the one who started it. She twisted something I said, fed it to the right person, and stepped back while the fallout hit me. She let me apologize for things she caused. My stomach dropped. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and let the truth settle over me like a heavy blanket. The betrayal wasn't one mistake. It wasn't a moment of weakness. It was a pattern, a quiet strategy to keep herself centered and pitted while I carried the blame. I felt something in me soften and harden at the same time. Not anger. Anger would have been easier. What I felt was a slow, steady clarity, the kind that seeps in only after you've had enough. It was the realization that she had never been my friend in the way I believed. She liked my loyalty, not me. I typed back, thanking him for telling me, even though my hands trembled. He apologized again, said he just couldn't keep quiet anymore. I told him I understood. Sometimes people stay silent hoping things will fix themselves, but sometimes the truth becomes too heavy for them to carry. After the conversation ended, I sat there for a while, listening to the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. I watched the shadows stretch across the kitchen floor as the streetlights flicked on outside. And as the quiet grew deeper, so did something inside me. A calm resolution I hadn't felt until that night. I realized the betrayal wasn't just what she did. It was what she made me believe about myself. The doubt she let me drown in. The trust she chipped away at one gesture at a time. That was the deepest wound, because it came from someone I had loved like family. By the time I stood up from the table, I knew exactly what I needed to do next. Not in anger, not in desperation, but with a quiet certainty that felt steady in my chest. Justice wouldn't be loud or dramatic. It would be a simple shift, a withdrawal she would feel more than any. Confrontation. I took a slow breath, feeling the cool air settle into my lungs. My heartbeat steadied, and in that stillness I made my decision. I would show her, finally and clearly, that the person she underestimated was done playing her game. Before I turned off my phone, I scrolled through our old messages, letting my eyes move over memories that now felt different. Moments I once believed were genuine suddenly carried new meaning. The compliments felt calculated, the comfort felt conditional, and the apologies sounded like practice lines meant to keep me close. Each message revealed a layer I had missed. Instead of hurting me further, the truth grounded me. For the first time, I felt fully aware, and finally in control. I woke up the next morning with a kind of calm I didn't recognize at first. It wasn't peace, not exactly. It was more like the weight had finally settled into a place where I could hold it without shaking. The sunlight coming through my blinds felt softer than usual, almost muted, and for a moment I just sat there, letting the quiet fill the room. I wasn't thinking about confrontation or dramatic speeches. I wasn't imagining shouting or exposing her in some public, chaotic way. What I wanted was something cleaner, truth, distance, and the kind of silence that can't be spun into a lie. My plan started with the smallest step, removing her access. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my phone, scrolling through settings and lists. I didn't block her, not yet. Blocking is loud. Blocking announces something. Instead, I restricted her, quietly, deliberately. She wouldn't see my posts anymore. She wouldn't know who I spoke to or what I was doing. She wouldn't read the parts of my life she had always used as raw material for manipulation. It was like turning off a faucet she didn't know she'd been drinking from. As I went through my apps, I noticed how many of my moments she'd commented on, how many bestie messages she had sent under pictures she later twisted behind my back. Every heart emoji felt different now. Every proud of you seemed hollow. But instead of hurting, it all made sense, like the final pieces sliding into place. The next step was the truth. Not the dramatic version, just the simple, factual reality. The people she had misled, the ones she had influenced with her half-whispers and jokes said with a tilted smile, those people deserved the truth. And I wanted it said in a way she couldn't twist. So I wrote a message, calm and measured, addressing only what mattered. I didn't attack. I didn't speculate. I didn't turn it into a story. I simply wrote what happened, what I discovered, and how long it had gone on. My fingers hovered over the send button for a long moment. I read the words again. Steady, clear, honest. Then I exhaled and sent it. Not to everyone, just to the ones who had been pulled into her orbit without realizing it. People who deserved the clarity I never got. When the messages delivered, I didn't feel nervous. I felt clean, like I had rinsed something heavy from my hands. After that, I put my phone face down and walked to the kitchen. The floor felt cool under my feet, and the smell of coffee filled the air as it brewed. I leaned against the counter, listening to the quiet drip of the machine, and realized that this silence, distance, honesty was the kind of revenge she never expected. She had always relied on noise. She thrived on stories, distortions, misdirections. She counted on confusion because confusion made her powerful. But clarity was something she couldn't manipulate. When she finally noticed the shift, it didn't take long for her to react. The first message came around noon. Just a simple, "Hey, are you okay?" The kind of message she always used to check the temperature before deciding which version of herself to send next. I saw the notification flash across my screen, but I didn't open it. My pulse didn't move. My hands stayed steady as I reached for my coffee instead. The next message came an hour later, longer, more dramatic. She said she felt like something was off, that she was worried, that she hoped she hadn't done anything to upset me. I didn't open that one either. She wanted a reaction. She wanted emotional access. She wanted the door cracked just enough to slip through. But silence was my answer. Silence, for someone like her, was louder than any accusation. By evening, she switched tones. Her messages became sharper, more urgent. She wanted to talk. She needed to talk. She said she didn't like feeling shut out. And beneath the lines, I could sense it. The moment she realized something had changed in a way she couldn't predict. I still didn't respond. Instead, I scrolled through my phone and watched as people replied to my earlier messages with quiet understanding. Some with apologies, others with disbelief that they hadn't seen it sooner. Each reply strengthened something in me. Not the desire to hurt her, just the certainty that I was doing exactly what needed to be done. She wasn't being attacked. She was simply being seen. Around midnight, she sent the message I had known would come eventually. A long paragraph, frantic and shaky, filled with explanations that didn't explain anything and apologies that dodged responsibility. She said she didn't know what people were talking about. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said she thought we were strong enough to get through anything. But that was the thing, we were never anything. I was the one holding the friendship together. She was the one pulling threads from behind the scenes. I didn't reply, not because I wanted to punish her, but because some truths only need space to echo. When I finally set my phone down and climbed into bed, I felt a quietness settle into me that I hadn't felt in months. She was facing the consequences she created, not because I destroyed her, but because I removed the shelter she had always found in my silence. And in that still moment before sleep pulled me under, I realized something simple and steady. The strongest revenge wasn't anger. It was freedom. I didn't expect the morning after everything unfolded to feel so still. There was no dramatic shift in the air, no sudden sense of triumph, just a quiet, steady awareness of myself. I sat at the edge of my bed with the early light slipping through the curtains, warming the side of my face, and realized I was breathing easier than I had in months. The space she once filled in my mind had finally been cleared, and in that space, something softer began to grow. As I moved through the house, making coffee and straightening small things on the counter, I caught myself noticing how different everything felt without the constant weight of her presence. I wasn't checking my phone. I wasn't rehearsing conversations in my head. I wasn't questioning whether I was overreacting or expecting too much. The silence wasn't anxious anymore, it was freeing. Felt like I finally had room to hear my own thoughts again. While the coffee cooled in my hands, I thought about the beginning. The version of me who trusted so easily. The version who didn't hesitate to open doors and share pieces of my life without worrying where they might end up. I remembered how much love I had put into that friendship, how much of myself I offered without condition. And for a moment, I mourned that version of me because she was good. She didn't deserve to be taken advantage of. But I also realized something else. I wasn't returning to that old version. I wasn't going backward. I was moving forward with the kind of strength that only comes from surviving something painful. Every boundary I set now felt like a small promise to myself. Every moment of peace felt earned. Later that day, I walked outside, letting the cold air wrap around me. It sharpened my senses, grounding me in the present. I watched my breath fade into the air and felt the small stones under my shoes as I walked. It was strange how the world kept moving, even when I felt like mine had cracked open weeks ago. People drove past, kids played down the street, someone walked a dog across the road. Life didn't pause for heartbreak, and maybe that was a gift. As I walked, I reflected on the lessons I never asked for but couldn't ignore. I learned that loyalty without boundaries becomes self-sacrifice, that forgiveness without accountability becomes permission, that silence can be compassion, but it can also be a cage when you're the only one inside it. And most importantly, I learned that love, real love, never asks you to shrink to make someone else feel bigger. There were moments when I wondered if I should forgive her, not to let her back in, but for my own sake. I didn't want to carry her actions with me any longer than I had to. Forgiveness, I realized, didn't have to mean reconciliation. Could simply mean releasing the emotional debt she left behind. Could mean acknowledging the pain, understanding its shape, and then letting it drift somewhere outside my own body. Standing there on the sidewalk, I felt a small swell of gratitude for the people who had shown me what real loyalty looked like. Friends who checked in, who didn't need explanations to stand by me, who didn't get manipulated by her subtle distortions. Their presence reminded me that betrayal isn't the whole story. Sometimes it's just the part that wakes you up. When I returned home, the house felt warm and familiar. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where so many realizations had hit me, and I let myself absorb the full journey. I thought about the trust one had given so freely. I thought about the lies she told behind my back. I thought about the night I discovered the final truth, and the morning I decided to stop letting her shape my life. And I realized that everything I had gone through had carved out a new understanding of love and loyalty, one rooted in clarity, strength, and self-respect. I knew now what I deserved. People who speak truth even when it's uncomfortable, who celebrate my wins without jealousy, who hold my name gently when I'm not around. People who don't feed off my vulnerability, but protect it. People who treat loyalty as something mutual, not something to exploit. The betrayal still hurt, but it no longer owned me. It became a kind of marker in my life, a line between who I was and who I was becoming. And instead of looking at that line with bitterness, I felt a kind of strange gratitude. Because without it, I might never have learned to trust myself as fiercely as I do now. As the evening sun settled low against the wall, painting the room in a warm amber glow, I felt a quiet sense of closure settle into my chest. Not dramatic, not loud, just steady. My story didn't end with her betrayal, continued with my healing. And as I leaned back in my chair, I thought about the title of this whole journey. How on my birthday, she hugged me while her betrayal waited in my inbox. It felt far away now, almost like a story that happened to someone else. But the person who lived through it was stronger, clearer, and more grounded than the one who started it. That was the final lesson betrayal gave me. Sometimes the people who break your heart are the same ones who teach you how to protect it. And sometimes the hurt that nearly destroys you is the same hurt that finally sets you free.